It's tough to say because we're not dealing with a theory in any sense in which, say, a physicist would recognize the theory. We're dealing with a collection of anecdotes, a certain point of view, a series of hunches. You turn to the serious sciences, you turn to general relativity or quantum mechanics. I can program a computer with the equations of general relativity or with the equations of quantum mechanics, and I can say, all right, what are the consequences? I can actually see the consequences emerge in a simulation. We can't do any of this in biology. And that should prompt any reasonable person to ask, why not? If this is such a simple mechanism, which could easily be programmed on a computer, how come we can't set up a computer and create something of biological-like complexity? How come we cannot see the unfolding of an evolutionary process the way we can see the unfolding of an evolutionary process in physics? 50 years after the computer revolution began, we have a splendid tool for assessing the intelligibility and viability of Darwinian theory. And everything that we know, I think this is the uniform experience of anyone working in genetic algorithms, indicates these mechanisms will not work. They will not work for their intended purposes. And finally, there's the utter absence of laboratory evidence. I mean, random variation, natural selection, we should be able to start manipulating organisms. When we look at dogs, no matter how far back we go, it's dogs. When we look at bacteria, no matter what we do, they stay bugs. They don't change in their fundamental nature. There seems to be some sort of an inherent species limitation, and we have no good explanation for this in terms of a Darwinian theory. We should have far more flexibility, far more plasticity under laboratory conditions than we actually do if Darwinian theory or anything like that were correct. What we see in nature, what we see in the laboratory, is very highly bounded variation, cyclic variation, as for example finch beaks in the Galapagos Island. That's about all we see. Small variations. Why is that if Darwinian theory is correct? These are evidentiary points that I think need to be stressed, need to be examined openly, honestly. And they never are, of course. Never are.
Welcome to another episode of Christian Answers. My name is Pastor Jeff Short, and today we are continuing to evaluate the Richard Dawkins book, The Greatest Show on Earth, The Evidences for Evolution, and we are looking at the first illustration that he uses. We've covered this before in a previous video, but I want to spend a little more time on it before I move on in the book, because a lot of people point to this example as an actual observable example of evolution taking place, and Richard Dawkins uses this as an example of evolution taking place today. So I want to spend some time on it because a lot of people are bothered by the fact that I have criticized this example, and that is the example of the dog breedings. Dogs are bred by humans over many generations to produce all kinds of different types of dogs, and this is supposed to be an example of evolution. And Richard Dawkins actually says in his book, he says that if you can imagine thousands and tens of thousands and 100,000 and 1,000,000 years of such change taking place, you would have basically dogs transforming into all kinds of different animals using the same process of change that we see in the dog breeding of today. And I challenge that, and I question that, and I say that is simply not true. If you take the same process that's being used today in dog breeding, you will get in 1,000, 10,000, even 1,000,000 years, you would get a wide variety of different kinds of dogs, but you would still be dealing with dogs. That's what you take away from the dog breeding example. Not that you have this grand scale process of evolution that Richard Dawkins is claiming. Now, I noticed on a lot of the comments that when you begin to criticize this example, people challenge you on the, you don't know what a theory is, you don't know what a fact is, you don't know what science is, you're questioning the academy and so forth. Well, I am simply looking at one example that is given, a popular example that's given for evolution, and I'm saying this example doesn't provide evidence for the large grand scale evolution that we see today. So I'm not getting into everything all at once. I'm just simply saying, show me a way from the dog breeding illustration that you can get large-scale evolution occurring. Show me. Show me the data. Show me where breeders are able to transform a dog into almost any kind of a creature or any kind of an animal. Now, if you look at what Darwin knew about genetics, what he knew about dog breeding, I could imagine that a person like Darwin could say, well, you know, if you carry on this process thousands and tens of thousands and millions of years, you would see large-scale transformation of dogs into totally, completely different kinds of animals, and then from those different kinds of animals into totally other kinds of animals, and you would get this continual developing process taking place, this sort of plastic biology where you can infinitely mold anything into anything else given enough time, given enough natural adaptation, and so forth. And that's what Darwinism would actually predict. Darwinism actually predicts that you could breed dogs into all kinds of different other kinds of creatures, actually transform them out of the category dog, and you could get totally different lines of biological development. That's what Darwinism would predict. Well, what we actually see in scientific laboratory studies, in the science, the hard data that we have coming out of the dog breeding activity, is that you don't get those grand sweeping changes of dogs becoming something else. You get a wider variety of dogs, but you get dogs in the end, and you still get dogs. Now, what does that mean? That means that there are inherent limits in biological types. You have limits. It's there. It didn't have to be there. That's a key point. It didn't have to be there. Nature didn't have to be that way. It could have been that when you take dogs and breed them, you can breed them out of doghood into something else. It could have been that way. And for all Darwin knew, it could have developed that way, given enough generations of breeding dogs. But it isn't that way. And we're still in the situation where if you want to use dog breeding as an illustration of the grand sweeping scale of evolution, you're going to have to come up with more information than we have today that shows that. Because what you have today is, if you take the dog breeding situation and multiply it 1,000 times, you still get dogs. If you take the dog breeding and multiply it 10,000 times, 100,000 times, 1,000,000 times, you still get dogs. That's the point. You have to get that point. You still have dogs. And it's the same way with every single other kind of biological creature that you try to breed on a large scale, rapid breeding, whether it's fruit flies or any kind of else, you get the same kind. And so why is that? Why is that? Darwinism would predict something else. Now, if you want to make the leap and jump to the conclusion, well, those are just trivial things, in the end, Darwinism is the mechanism for evolving anything into anything, given enough time and the natural setting and situation. You can basically see that a dog might evolve into something of another kind. But that is something that goes beyond the evidence. That's something that goes beyond the data. You can't get that from the hard science. And that's the point I wanted to make. And that's the point that people are upset about, because I'm not following the Darwinian orthodoxy of most scientists. Now, one person said, are you questioning an entire field of study? Are you questioning the scientific consensus? I am pointing out an example that is frequently used and saying that that doesn't give example of evolution. That's what I'm saying. And I challenge anyone, from the actual evidence that we have from dog breeding, to show me how you can get this claim that this same process will produce this kind of grand sweeping transformation that the grand scale of evolution shows. Now, Richard Dawkins himself says, imagine, he says in his book, imagine this same process, the dog breeding process, the changes that we see in, for example, Chihuahua, the difference between a Chihuahua and a Great Dane. Imagine that kind of change multiplied by 1,000,000 years, and you can get a picture for what the power of evolution. Okay, now my challenge to that example is, your conclusion is not coming from the evidence and the data that we have available in dog breeding. Your conclusion is coming from your faith and your belief in the theory of grand scale evolution. Because if you go just on the data that we have and just on the evidence that we have today, you will have 1,000, 10,000, 1,000,000 years from now, many more different types of dogs, but still a dog. That's based on what we know today. So whatever you're trying to prove using this illustration, you're not proving it. In fact, you're showing and giving evidence for the opposite. And just because the scholarly opinion right now is that, well, this illustrates grand scale evolution, doesn't mean that the argument holds ground. You have to prove it. And it doesn't matter how many scientists say, yes, this is a good illustration, or it doesn't matter how many in the field of biology say this is a valid illustration. You have to show that it is. You have to prove that it is. And I'm simply saying, you haven't proved it. You haven't shown it. It's not enough to say, imagine 1,000,000 years from now. That's not a valid scientific argument. I mean, I can imagine a lot of things. That's the same kind of argument that people make this wacky ancient astronaut or alien astronaut theory on the History Channel, where they say, imagine aliens seeding the planet Earth with life. Imagine that visitors came to this planet millions of years ago. Imagine, yeah, we can imagine all kinds of things. That isn't a valid scientific argument. What is a valid scientific argument is if you can show, using the dog breeding illustration, that you can create some other kind of animal other than a dog through that breeding process, starting with a dog. And it would even help if you could do that even in the laboratory through genetic manipulation. You take a dog and then you manipulate the DNA to the point where you start with a dog and you end up with something entirely different. That would be a start of the evidence you would need to show that your argument is valid. Now, that wouldn't be an airtight argument that your argument is valid, because you're using laboratory manipulation. You are taking an intelligent agent and you're manipulating the DNA purposely for the sole reason of transforming one kind of an animal into another. And if you could do it, at least in principle, in the laboratory with scientists manipulating the DNA, that would be a step in the right direction for giving the kind of evidence you would need to support the kind of claims that Dawkins makes in this book. But short of that, even that happening, you don't have anything like evidence to support the claim that the dog breeding process that we see today is an illustration of evolution on a small scale. And if you just multiply that a million years, you're going to get the kind of sweeping changes that we associate with the theory of evolution. No, I'm sorry, you don't have the evidence. And I'm not the only one that has pointed this out. This has been pointed out by many people over the decades since Darwinism and the neo-Darwinian revolution. This has been pointed out over and over again, but I guess from the comments, people simply don't want to accept the fact that this is not evidence for evolution. Dog breeding, the great changes that are taking place, taking your standard mutt dog and transforming that dog into something like a Chihuahua on one end or a Great Dane on the other end, shows a wide variety of changes that can come about through reshuffling the gene pool, through selective breeding. You can take the kind of animal, the dog, and you can breed that dog into all kinds of expressions. But that is entirely different. It's an entirely different thing to say, then see that process where we reshuffle a gene pool and we create all of these different breeds of dogs. That same process is how everything evolves. That's how the fish came out of the waters onto the land and became reptiles, and then the reptiles became mammals, and so on and so forth. That's not the same kind of process that we observe today. So what is happening? How is Richard Dawkins making the leap from the limited kind of change that we see in the dog breeding activity that is well documented? How does he make that kind of change into the grand scale evolutionary change that he is arguing for in his book? He does it by faith. He does it by his belief in the theory. And what you have to do is you have to actually make the theory part of your evidence. You have to take what is taking place in dog breeding, and then you have to add the theory to it, and then you get the kind of conclusion he talks about in his book. And what I'm saying is, without the theory, you don't get to that conclusion. Without his belief in that process actually occurring, you don't get to his conclusion. But I'm saying, no, show me the evidence today, right now, observable, that doesn't require me to already believe in that conclusion before I look at the evidence. I want to be able to see the evidence, and then the evidence takes me to that conclusion. Because as a Christian, as a biblical Christian, as a Bible-believing Christian, I have information in the Bible which I hold as revelation. I know a lot of people today don't believe in the concept of revelation. They don't even believe in the idea of revelation. They don't believe that there is a God who actually can speak. Or if they do believe a God exists, they think he's silent. They think he's quiet. They think he doesn't know how to talk. But the God of the Bible is expressed as a God who speaks and communicates and reveals himself to people. And what he has done is revealed himself through prophets. They're called prophets. They're voices. They're mouthpieces of God. And one of the prophetic writers, one of the prophetic mouthpieces of God in the Old Testament of the Bible was Moses. And Moses recorded Genesis. In the early chapters of Genesis, he says that God created the land creatures after their kind, and the sea creatures after their kind. And we have reference to this limitation within nature, that if God creates, for example, men and women, they will be men and women. They will stay men and women. They will not evolve into something entirely different or of a different kind. And so we have evidence in Revelation, the biblical revelation, that nature has fixed kinds. And lo and behold, that's exactly what we see in the hard science today. And the example of dog breeding perfectly illustrates this. If you were to look at the evidence of the activity of dog breeding, you would say, wow, isn't it fantastic how dog breeders can mold and shape and sculpt dogs into all kinds of different breeds, but there's a limit. There's an inherent limit in how far they can go in sculpting and shaping the dog. And past a certain point, they cannot go any further. That's science. That's hard data. That's something that every person, like a Richard Dawkins, who's arguing for the grand scale of evolution, has to deal with. What we know today, scientifically, is that there are limits. If you can show that those limits can be crossed and that dogs can, in fact, be bred into a different kind of an animal, then you would be presenting the kind of evidence you would need to substantiate the grand scale of evolution. But there isn't that kind of evidence yet. Now, if you have it, if you know of any kind of evidence that would show that you can take a dog and transform it into something other than a dog, then show me, because I'm not aware of anything right now. I've never read of anything like that. I have never heard anyone lecture on that. And so I'm unaware of that kind of data. If you have it, present it, and then we'll talk some more. But as of right now, there is no evidence for that. And so therefore the whole illustration of the dog breeding falls flat on its face. There's nothing you can give in that evidence that would show grand scale evolution. Now, I'm going to go further in the book. I'm reviewing the entire book. I'm going to go further. I'm going to talk about some of the other evidences that he wants to put forth. But I just wanted to touch on this because a lot of people criticize my video and say, well, wait a minute, you don't understand the theory of evolution. I do understand the theory of evolution. I don't make the same mistakes that a lot of people who really don't understand the theory of evolution make in trying to criticize it. I do understand the theory of evolution, and I'm not refuting every piece of evidence at this point. I'm just simply saying that one of the first evidences that Dawkins gives is invalid. It doesn't hold weight. And I'm not criticizing the other evidences he gives yet, because I haven't gotten to them yet. I haven't reviewed that part yet on this video, and so I'm not going to try to tackle everything at once. One of the problems that I find that when I talk with someone who wants to defend the theory, the grand scale of evolution, is that we're talking about one specific point, and all of a sudden everything gets thrown in. Everything is thrown into the mix, and so you're trying to deal with probably 10, 20, 30 pieces of evidence now instead of this one. Well, I'm not refuting 20 or 30 pieces of evidence right now. I'm refuting one piece of evidence, and the one piece of evidence I'm refuting is the illustration of dog breeding. And I've even heard that in the London Museum they have a whole exhibit specifically on dog breeding as an example of grand scale evolution. So this is a very popular and powerful bit of evidence that is used to get people thinking in terms of, wow, I can actually see evolution taking place before me, and through in just a matter of generations, we can see that the evolution is taking place. Look at what the dog has become. It started out as a generic dog, and now this thing has been transformed into little Chihuahuas and big Great Danes. So look at all of that change that took place, and if that kind of change can take place on a limited human time scale, just think of what can happen millions of years. And this is a popular illustration. It's used for, like I said, in the London Museum, textbooks, lectures, teachings. It's used by Richard Dawkins here as a prime example. Darwin used it in his original book. It is a massive, powerful tool of propaganda. I have to say that, because when you look at it, and I challenge you, look at the evidence, put away all the other arguments for the grand scale of evolution. We'll get to those later, but just look at the dog breeding illustration and ask yourself, does that illustration carry the weight of the grand scale evolution? And you'll have to conclude it does not. It does not. We do not have the kind of change you need to carry the weight of the grand scale of evolution. Now you may say, well, yeah, but that's not the only piece of evidence. There's all this other stuff. Okay, great. Fine, that's fantastic. And we'll get to that other evidence. But you have to admit that on a purely objective, rational basis, you are trying to take a change in the reshuffling of a gene pool, that kind of change, and you're trying to then transform that and use that as the basis for a change of a different kind, the grand scale evolution, and you have to admit that doesn't follow. So that's the only thing I was trying to do with this, and I don't want to beat a dead horse. I don't want to keep going over and over and over this. I just want to say that the first illustration that Richard Dawkins uses in his book, The Greatest Show on Earth, Evidence for Evolution, fails to prove, or fails to even qualify as evidence for the theory, the grand theory of evolution, the kind that he's talking about and the kind that he's trying to prove in this book. It fails. Hands down, no question. I'm going to be talking about some of his other arguments in the future. I'm going to be examining every single controversial piece of evidence that he uses. Now, one of the things about Richard Dawkins is he's a good teacher, and he knows his subject, and he's got a sharp mind. But those things don't mean that when he puts together an argument that it's automatically valid and it automatically proves his point. And so we're going to go through his book, and we're going to look at them critically, and we're going to lay it all out, and hopefully you can make up your own mind. Don't simply say, well, you know, the Academy has decided that thus and so is true, or this is false, or whatever. No, look at the argument yourself, decide for yourself, look at the evidence, decide for yourself, and use your own mind, use your own head, use your own God-given brain to process this. And as we go through his book, we're going to talk about these, and let's move forward together. Let's critically examine this theory called evolution, and let's see where we end up. Well, I hope that that's been helpful to you, and we'll see you back another episode of Christian Answers. God bless.